Welcome to another presentation from the House of David Fellowship in Richmond, Virginia. I'm Lee Miller. Today, we are going to be picking up where we left off. We ended at Acts 15, verse 21. We spent a good number of services going through Acts 15 and trying to understand what James wrote, also understanding what the prophets said that he referred to. So it took a while to track all of that down. But now that that's been done, and we have a very clear understanding of the four prohibitions, why they were chosen, what was the plan, we can now go forward with Acts 15:22. Now, the last meeting, we did a summary of chapter 1 and chapter 2 of the book of James, and the reason we did that is because we wanted to make sure that we clearly understood who this man was in Acts chapter 15 who gave this, what should I say, writing, at least a definitive statement on how Gentiles were to attach themselves to Israel throughout the known world in the first century. This was the writing. This is where they start. He laid it down. So we spent some time going through James 1 and James 2, just to make sure that we had not overreached in trying to interpret and understand what he wrote. So last service, we summed that up with a review of both chapters to make sure we were clear. So today we're going to pick up Acts 15:22, moving forward. There's no specified amount of slides that we're going to necessarily cover. We're just going to go, and then at some point we'll stop, and then the service after that we will pick up at that, and we will continue until we finish the book of Acts. And then, of course, we will take up the rest of the history of the first century, especially those parts that people just don't like to talk about. But all in good time. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at what we're going to do today to introduce Acts 15:22. I call it on tap. Now, there are so many things that we could talk about to get ready for this study that I could take up the entire time just doing an introduction, which pains me because I really would like to do that, but I'm not going to allow that. We're going to try to keep it somewhat short and on point. There are three things I'd like for you to keep in mind, and we're going to go through each one of those three, and I'm going to break them down to some degree. Then, there's going to be a couple of Greek words that I want to look at in this intro before we get to Acts 15:22 moving forward. Now, there's going to be several Greek words that we're actually going to talk about in detail as we get to them, but I wanted to go over these two so that we could begin to orient our mind into what Paul's plan was and how it proceeded and some of the events that took place. So I'm not going to say that it's going to happen in every session, but there is a good possibility that in many or most of the sessions throughout the book of Acts, we'll probably do some Greek word study at the beginning so that we can prepare for what the text says. And the reason I like doing this is because sometimes the English translations do not fully pick up the nuances of the particular Greek word, and I like to make that at least available to those who are listening, those who are reading, so that they can rethink what's taking place, try to go outside the box, see what they see what they hear. So that's what we're going to do after we take a look at three things to keep in mind. Then we're going to look at a couple of Greek words, and then we're going to go ahead and proceed with the text. So let's go ahead and get started with the first of three things. Number one, Luke wrote the book of Acts well after the temple was destroyed, and this writing was predominantly for Gentiles. And when we're talking about Gentiles, we're talking about pagans. Now, they're not all pagans, so don't think that they're all pagans, because we have some that are God-fearers. They had already come to a knowledge of the Torah. they were following a good portion of it. There may have been some specific things they did not follow, but pretty much they were in the game, and they just needed a few other things. Basically, they needed to understand Yeshua was the appointed Messiah. That was pretty important, and we see that revealed in Acts chapter 10, which of course we've already gone over. But anyway, I want to start out with this thing. Luke wrote Acts well after the temple, and predominantly for the Gentiles. So I have an example here, all right, and I want to talk about, just so that you can understand where I'm coming from on this concept. I've written down fundraiser. I've written it down twice. The first one is South Africa, and the second one is Virginia. So let's say that I went to the assembly, and I'm in South Africa, and I went to the assembly and I said, listen, let's do a fundraiser. Let's prepare a whole bunch of cook sisters. Everybody's going to know exactly what I'm talking about. They're going to know exactly what they need to do, what it's going to look like, what it's going to taste like, etc. If I was in Virginia and I said, hey, I'm gathering with the assembly, let's have a fundraiser. Let's prepare a bunch of cook sisters. They're going to look at me like like maybe I was an alien or something, because Cook Sisters is not a well-known fundraising type of food in Virginia. If I was going to use the same analogy, I would say, let's buy a bunch of Krispy Kreme and sell those. Everybody knows what Krispy Kreme donuts are in Virginia, and everybody knows what a Cook Sister is in South Africa. So if I was doing something for my particular audience, I'm going to do something they are aware of. So that's what I mean when Luke wrote Acts. He was writing to a predominantly Gentile group, and so we need to keep that in mind. So look at this next bullet here. In writing to Gentiles, would use words and phrases that the pagans would understand, and avoid words and phrases that they would have no idea what they mean. Because if you're going to write something that people are going to read and you don't explain in exhausting detail what that word means, then who knows what they're going to take away from what you wrote. So you just don't do that. You write so that the people who are reading or perhaps are hearing your work read, either way, you write so that there are things in there that they will understand. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention. And I'm going to continue to build on that point with point 2. I'm going to talk about Google Calendar. A Protestant Christian, that's PC, Protestant Christian scholar asked the following very fundamental question. He said, how did Paul's communities reckon time? Now there's 3 options. They didn't have a calendar. They continue following their pagan calendar, or they used the biblical calendar. Those are pretty much the 3 options that are available. Now, on this particular slide here, I have a journal, which I wanted to just review a bit of it. We've covered this before. For those people who are keeping score at home, we actually went through this 6 years ago. That's 2011, April the 2nd, and the work that we determined we published in a public forum, and everybody's been able to have access since that time period. But I need to just go over a few of the quotes that Dr. Troy Martin made, because they're going to relate to the first point, which falls under things I just want you to be aware of as we're going through Acts. That the things that are said relate to the audience that he's speaking to. That was the thing that I wanted to make sure that we were clear on. At this particular, but I just want to mention, you can see it on the slide, but this particular journal article is called Pagan and Judeo-Christian Timekeeping Schemes in Galatians 4:10 and Colossians 2:16. And in our next presentation, we're going to actually go back and take a look at the Colossians 2:16 a little bit more, because there's some points that you need to be aware of and some questions that need to be asked that we need to discuss. But we're not going to do it in this one. I'm just going to mention these quotes, and then we're going to go ahead and move forward. All right, these are the quotes directly out of the article. Only by avoiding timekeeping altogether, or by adhering to the Jewish calendar, could the Pauline communities escape idolatrous alternatives. And what did we just learn in Acts 15 in the 4 things that James said? We're supposed to be avoiding things that are based around idolatry. Whatever flavor, whatever perspective, if it kind of touches on idolatry, we're supposed to be trying to avoid that. The calendar would be one of those things. So he asked this question, and then this is his statement. Only by avoiding timekeeping altogether, that was the none option, or adhering to the Jewish calendar, so that's the biblical calendar, so that's one. And then there's only one left, that's idolatry. He says also other timekeeping systems name the days and the months after pagan deities and mark out the seasons by pagan rites. In contrast, the Jews distinguish the seasons by festivals that obviously have no pagan connotations, and there is a reason why he said it that way. They recognize the months by new moons and name these months using agricultural terms. They designate the week by Sabbaths, and beginning from the Sabbath they number, instead of name, the days of the week 1 through 6. The only options available to Paul and his communities are Jewish, pagan, or no timekeeping system at all, and the evidence indicates they opt for the former. And the article goes into a lot of detail about that and what other Protestant Christian scholars have to say about this subject, and that's why we're going to go into it in more detail in the next presentation. And that way we won't take over the entire presentation, this time with the intro. Anyway, conclusion, if the author continues to use biblical time references in his writing, think back to point number 1. You're going to use things that your audience is going to understand. If the author continues to use biblical time references in his writing, might this indicate that the intended audience has at least some familiarity with those calendar terms? In other words, are you really going to use Sabbath and new moon and other type of calendar references of that nature to an audience who has never heard of it? It's just a question. And the last bullet on the slide, in our next segment, we will review Colossians 2:16, 17 in more detail as it regards Acts going forward, which you'll have 2 weeks now to be able to do that if time permits in your schedule, so that you can see exactly how we are unrolling this and the understanding that we have. As a matter of fact, I just want to share on the House of David Fellowship Facebook page, just recently, like just a little over a month ago, a young lady wrote the following comment. She said, "The teaching for Galatians, Colossians, and the history of the church should be mandatory for entry into any congregation." And it just made me smile, because it would appear that she went over this particular teaching on Colossians, the Galatian problem, which we're going to get into in this presentation, at least I think we are. It appears that she came away feeling like she understood things more clearly, and it just made me smile that she was taking that position. So I just wanted to share with you that took place just over a month ago. This is number 3. This is a very simple thing. The culture and customs of the people the writer was associated with guides events by the decisions they make. And so I want you to consider that Acts is not the script to a movie. And everybody has those things that they're supposed to say, and they have those actions that they're supposed to do. That's not what's taking place here. There are surprises, there are illegal actions, and a variety of other things that take place. We're going to get into that shortly here. As these stories unfold, we need to take note of how the author presents the responses of the different parties involved. Now, there's the parties of the missionaries. It could be Luke himself. There could be people in an assembly There could be people that he's talking to that are like God-fearers. There could be people who are opposed to this message. And these people react certain ways and things unfold. And so what I want you to do is to just be aware. You're going to have to ask some questions. Like, why would they have done that? Why did they do that? What if they had done this? How would that have been different? These will allow you to think through the things that take place, because as we're getting ready to move from our three things, we're moving to our Greek word study. And you're going to see some points that are in the Greek word study that are going to kind of like set the stage for what we're trying to do. So let's go ahead and just move straight into that. Our first word here is dialegomai. Let me show you what it looks like if we put in these dashes that I added. You have dia, lego, me. And so that's the spelling there in the Greek. Now, in Freiburg, you can see this is number 6308 in Freiburg. Here's his definition. Of a reasoned discussion, discuss, discourse with, conduct a discussion. Also, of speaking to someone in order to reason with. So you want to reason with a person. In the Septuagint, most of the time it was translated as speaking to someone. It continued to slightly evolve by the time we get to the 1st century. Josephus, the historian, in all of his writings, it is a total of 74 occurrences, and 49 refer to a discussion about some subject. Philo, also in the time period of the 1st century and the 1st century before the 1st century, 25 occurrences, 18 denote conversation. So you can see it still has some of the old definition, and it is evolving a little bit into the newer conversation. Also, TDNT, which is Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, Volume 2, page 97. This is a 6-page article for this word, which covers over 1,000 years, every use of it. They note for judicial investigation and decision. So I thought that was good. I thought that was strong for that word as it continues to evolve the way it's used. And the reason that we are taking the time to be up to speed with it is that in the next 8 chapters in Acts, this word occurs 8 times. And these occurrences are very significant. So that's why we want to take a look at this word before we get into the text. A Protestant Christian commentary on the book of Acts, it's called Smith and Helles, I think that's how you pronounce that. This is a quote from page 300. The presenting of arguments using Scripture as a basis, or the engaging in dialogue and debate over the meaning of scriptural texts. Okay, I like that. And one of the things that I've always tried to remember is that the scriptures that they had at the time, the Tanakh, which is the Torah, writings, and prophets, there were some things that are clearly said. They're just clearly said, you understand what this means. Not a whole lot of hash. But then there's some other things in which, well, how does this apply? So, especially when you're looking at the prophets, I look at Paul in the early chapters of Acts, and when I say early chapters, I'm talking about before chapter 9. Paul is making his argument that Yeshua is not the Messiah, and he's got the reasons, and he'll quote the text clearly. Then, after he finds out that he was mistaken, this is chapter 9, and that Yeshua is the Messiah, then he goes back and the text does not change. He just looks at the text differently and sees it saying something else. And then he goes, of course, on his path to share this new way of interpreting certain texts when he goes into these synagogues, which we're going to see even more as we take a look at the actual story that Luke writes for us. As it unfolds, you're going to see how this works, and I've actually done some translation work to help us see this more clearly. But let's continue with this word. This is Ben Wetherington III. This is his commentary, The Acts of the Apostles, a socio-rhetorical commentary from 1998 on pages 505 and 506. He says, Paul appealed to them as people of intelligence, I think that's good, people of intelligence, who could discern the truth if the case was laid out before them in good logical fashion. Now I like that. I thought that was pretty good. So here's the summary so that we can have, this kind of condensed down. Dialogue is the road to enlightenment. You appeal to somebody, as that previous slide said, that the rhetorical commentary comment, Paul appeals to them as people of intelligence, and that if he could have an opportunity to lay the case out, well, they would understand and see it. Okay, and that's good. So, I have written dialogue is the road to enlightenment. What is the opposite of that? The opposite would be the refusal to allow free speech, the avoidance of substantive debate. In other words, if the two parties, if one of them does not want to hear what you have to say, that this is not the word you use. This word is the word that is used when the two parties want to come together to see if they can advance their understanding about something. So, in the first century, and this is outside the scope of this presentation, but they were looking for the Messianic kingdom. And of course, if you have the Messianic kingdom, then you have the Messiah. Unfortunately, they had been taught that Messiah ben David was coming, and that was not true because Messiah ben Joseph had to come first. So that caused some people some problems. They didn't quite get a handle on that. It took them a while. Not everybody got it, but a lot of them did, as we'll see later when we get further into the book of Acts. But I say all that to say that if somebody says, okay, this person is the Messiah, well, then let's take a look at the evidence. But to say, no, I'm not going to hear a thing you say, I'm going to suppress what you're saying, that is not dia lego me. That's not what that word means. That word means that we're actually going to dialogue and discuss this. And what you're going to see, and we'll bring this out when we get to those texts, is that when somebody does not want to allow free speech, actions that might arise out of this suppression include demonizing, demeaning, refusal to listen, dismissing, and any attempt to bring in an unauthorized judicial action, which you're going to see exactly that when we get to one of our early texts here in Acts. I think it's in chapter 16, I believe, is where this takes place. You're going to see exactly that problem. So, there you go. Get you prepared. Second Greek word of the two that we wanted to look at, this is called anakarino. Now, this word also, I could say that this is a cousin with the previous word, but let's take a look at Freiberg. It's number 1649. And he says, generally, of the process of evaluation, examine, question, study carefully, and two, as sifting evidence in judicial hearings, hold a preliminary hearing, cross-examine, investigate, interrogate. So as you can see here, and I did quote the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament in the previous definition, where it talked about a judicial aspect. Here you have a strong judicial aspect. Here we are expecting evidence to be presented, and we want to take a look at it because we want to have a careful study. We want to fully evaluate and examine what's being said here because maybe we need to make an adjustment. And that's what was happening in the synagogues, is that people were like, well, I don't see how Yeshua is the Messiah with A, B, C, D, and E. And then Paul would go and he would say, okay, let's take a look at the text. And then he would go through it and show them some things, and they would go, I can see that. And they would talk about it. So once again here, this is almost a stronger word, where the other one had more conversational debate, dialogue, kind of friendly type thing back and forth. This is the careful examination of what's going on. So I wanted to bring that to you as well. Another Greek dictionary, and this is the last one that I'm going to use for this particular word, that's Louw-Nida, 27.44, it says, to try to learn the nature or truth of something by the process of careful study, evaluation, and judgment, to examine carefully, to investigate, to study thoroughly. So, kind of the same family of ideas, just further into it, a deep, maybe you could say maybe it's the next level down. The first is the dialogue, the discussion, the debate. We want to talk back and forth. We're not going to say talk to the hand. We're going to be open to hear what you have to say. This word being the next level is, okay, now we're real, okay, I'm hearing what you're saying. We got to look at this. And so now comes that time when we're really going to do a thorough study. And this is what the Jews were doing in the first century, and you will see this as it unfolds in chapter 16 and 17. Okay, so let's go ahead and get to the text. We will start at Acts 15:22. Now, some of the verses, I'm going to put the text on the screen. Some other times, I may just summarize several verses because there's nothing there that I want to spend any type of focus or extreme amount of time on. It says what it says, and it's not the pieces that I want to look at. All the text is important, so I'm not taking away from that, but there are certain things that I want to really focus in on, maybe more specifically. So here we're going to start at 15:22. As you remember, 15:21 talks about the Gentiles being in the synagogue on the Sabbath, hearing the Torah. Okay, so here's 22. And it starts right off with the Greek word dokio. So let me tell you about that. Here's the text. Then it seemed good, which is the Greek word dokio, to the apostles, the elders, with the whole ecclesia, to send men chosen from among them to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas. And what were they going to do when they got there? They were going to read the writing. This whole thing was that you've got these people, they've gotten together, they've made some decisions, kind of formal decisions. As you can see by the next bullet, it says the Greek dokio is used to express the formal resolution of a Senate vote. Think Rome. When Rome got together and the senators talked about some legislative issue, then they would take a vote on it. And once the vote was affirmed, then this was the Greek word used to express the formal resolution of the Senate vote. That's where this word stands in its definition structure. So this is the word that Luke is using to a Greek-speaking audience about the decision that the apostles, the elders, and the whole ecclesia came to in the earlier section of Acts 15 at the level of a Senate vote on a piece of legislation that was going to be enforced. This is how Luke saw it. It seemed good to the apostles about this resolution. All right, Acts 15:23, they sent this letter with them. From the apostles and elders, your brothers, to the Gentile brothers and sisters in Antioch, Syria, and Cilicia, greetings. Now, verse 24. Verse 24 is one of those tricky verses. Depends on what Bible you're using in English. We're going to use a particular one here. This is verse 24. Since we've heard that some went out from us without our authority and disturbed you, upsetting your minds, saying, you must be circumcised and keep the law, to whom we gave no such commandment. That's what verse 24 says. But guess which part verse 24 does not say? Yes, that's correct. That part does not exist in the major text. There is a text that has it, and some versions have that there, but that's not the text. So depending on what translation you're using, I hope that most of them are cleaned up and realize that text is not there. The screen that you're looking at, this is slide 24. It's Acts 15:24. It says what is actually the text. Since we've heard that some went out from us without our authority and disturbed you, upsetting your minds. Because if you remember what we were talking about, it had to do with the Gentiles coming in. And we're going to talk more about that as we proceed, but let's just keep on trucking here. Next slide is Acts 15:28. For it seemed best to the Holy Spirit and to us not to place any greater burden on you than these necessary rules. And so then it lists the four that were stated earlier in Acts 15. Now I want to quote a commentary. This is a Protestant Christian commentary, PC commentary. It's called the International Critical Commentary, and the particular one is Acts Volume 2. In this particular case, the International Critical Commentary breaks Acts up into two parts. So this is volume 2, page 104 and 105. Now let's watch this really carefully here. The evident object, okay? Right there, the first thing is right off, the evident object. This is one of those manipulative tactics that a person would use to present a case they can't make. For example, somebody might say, any idiot would know. That tells you right there this person cannot make their case, so they're going to use some type of manipulative slander to try to squash people who are not strong and who know themselves, and to say, oh, well, I don't want to be classified as an idiot, so yeah, okay, I'm with you. No, we don't accept that here. So here, this is the quote. The evident object of the decree, was to remove as far as possible those obstacles which prevented free intercourse and communion between the believing Jews and Christians. Really? Okay, that was it? That was the key part? Because you know what's funny here? James is saying this story with Cornelius and Peter. He quotes it specifically before he begins with what he's saying about the rebuilding of the tabernacle of David, the tent of David. And he is saying that it's in agreement with the prophets. And we spent multiple weeks looking at what the prophets said. And you know what? I never saw anything that the prophets said that had to do with the evident object was to remove obstacles for communion. What I saw was this is the first steps for being able to attach yourself to Israel. But, you know, we already covered that. So just saying. Let's continue. The quote says, from this, so they've made their point, which they can't make, so they've made their point, and they're going to build on that as the foundation. They say, from this it follows that the decree of the Council of Jerusalem was only of temporary obligation. Oh my goodness. And here's the reason why. So long as the Jewish Christians persevered in their legal strictness and held it unlawful to partake of certain kinds of food. Yeah, this is the direct quote. Oh, by the way, International Critical Commentary, Book of Acts is available free online as a PDF. So you want it? You can get it. Let's continue. As soon as they were enabled to entertain more enlightened notions. We're talking about the Jewish Christians. We're talking about now this is their term, all the Jews who accepted that Yeshua was the Messiah. They're called Jewish Christians by Protestant Christianity. As soon as these Jewish Christians like James, all the apostles, that's Peter and Paul, all of them, as soon as they were enabled to entertain more enlightened notions. I have to say one thing, these guys do right well. The quote continues, and to perceive that in Christ, the distinction between clean and unclean meats was abolished, and that there was no kind of food unclean of itself, the obligation of the decree terminated. So as soon as these loser apostles and other Jews finally came to the realization that there was nothing that was unclean anymore, and of course we know where that teaching is. That's Romans 14, verse 14 by Paul, which we'll address in a moment. Then as soon as they realized, oh look, pork is good, lobster's good, we can have surf and turf, yeah, maybe some baby back ribs. Then the decree terminated. Did you know that? Okay, I know. Stop laughing. Okay. Let's go back to Romans 14:14. Here's the amazing thing. It doesn't say that nothing is unclean of itself. It says nothing is common of itself. But as we discussed, the English translation has had that wrong since KJV came out. That's 1611. They had it correct before then, but they didn't have it correct after that. Isn't that amazing? So all these commentaries built on this foundation. I'm talking commentaries from the 1800s, commentaries in the 1900s, commentaries in 2000. They're all building on a incorrect English translation of the text in Romans 14 to make their case. Doesn't that just make you sad for them? I mean, don't you feel? I feel bad for them. Isn't this terrible? Wow. Really? I expected a little more from you guys. Whew. My goodness. Moving on. Acts 15:35. This is 29 to 34. They went down to Antioch, gathered the people together, read the letter. The people were encouraged. All right. Paul and Barnabas remained in Antioch, where they and many others taught and preached the word of the Lord. Okay, probably should take a look at that. Then Paul and Barnabas had a disagreement on who to take on the missionary journey, so they split up, took different people going in two directions. Here's my thinking. Let's go back a slide. This would be slide 30. It says that they went down, read the letter, the people were encouraged, and Paul and Barnabas remained where they and many others taught and preached the word of the Lord. What was that? What was the word of the Lord? Well, if we're to take the Protestant Christian position that the word of the Lord was all the laws that you've been observing have been done away with. It's called law-free, which shows up in the International Critical Commentary. Along with other commentaries, they will use the law-free gospel of Paul. So if these were the only four you had to do, and they were only temporary until these ding-dongs were mentally enabled to realize that unclean food didn't exist anymore. Yeah, okay, you know where I'm coming from on this. As soon as they realize that, then this is gone too. Now we got 4, and soon we're going to have 0. So here we are preaching the word of the Lord. Just how long does it take to tell people who have been observing several hundred commandments that they don't have to do this anymore? Just how long does that take? How much teaching does it take to say, oh yes, by the way, these are the only 4 you got to do, and it's therefore a short amount of time, and then you don't have to do anything? Really? I'm not sure I'm buying this. All right, let's continue. We'll move now to slide 32, which is Acts 16, verses 1 through 3. Oh, this is a good one too. Paul came to Derbe, then to Lystra, where a disciple named Timothy lived, whose mother was Jewish. Keep that in mind. If you need visual aids, get your piece of paper out. Mother was Jewish and a believer. That's also just a little bit important. Father was a Greek. That's verse 1. Verse 2. The believers at Lystra and Iconium spoke well of Timothy. 3. Paul wanted to take him along on the journey, so he circumcised him because of the Jews who lived in that area, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. All right, let's think about this. So he circumcised him because of the Jews who knew the father was a Greek. Got to do some examination here. Mother was Jewish. So here's my first question. Is Timothy a Jew? Father was a Gentile. Was Timothy a Gentile? Let's examine the text. Let's not be overly concerned here about rabbinic fiction. And let's find out what the text says for what was happening in the first century. It's clear that if Paul was going to circumcise him, Timothy was not circumcised on the 8th day. Now Paul says, or Luke writing as narrator says, the circumcision was for what reason? Because the Jews would want him circumcised. Really? The Jews want this man circumcised. Why would they want him circumcised? Remember, it was for Jews that didn't believe too. So let's take a tangent, and we're now going to run over to the Galatians section, and this is that part that the young lady referred to on her Facebook when she posted on the Facebook page for House of David Fellowship, that this is one of the things that people should go to before they're allowed to enter an assembly. I love it. I really appreciate her saying that. Okay, Galatians 5, 1 through 4. Verse 1 says, "It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. Mark my words. I, Paul, tell you, if you let yourselves be circumcised, Christ will be of no value to you at all." All right, let's take a peering into the plain reading of the English text here. Verse 1 says, we have freedom with Christ. Therefore, stand firm, which means stand against, allowing yourselves to become a slave. Mark says, if you become circumcised, Christ will be of no value to you. Therefore, it would be very easy to say, okay, then what in the world has happened to Paul's brain? Because he's now going to circumcise Timothy, which means that Christ will be of no value to him. Really? Really? Just because the Jews would like for that to take place. Really? Is this what is really happening? Let me just be honest. I've got some doubts. Let's continue with our Galatians 5 passage. Verse 3 says, "Again, I declare to every man who lets himself be circumcised," which is exactly what he was doing to Timothy, "if you are circumcised, then you're obligated to obey the whole law." So, not only is Paul doing away with the work of Christ in Timothy's life, but now Timothy has to obey the entire law. Really? Is this the law-free apostle that's doing all of this of his own free will because he wants to impress the Jews? Struggling with this concept. I have to say I am struggling with this. Continuing to verse 4, let's get some clarity on the issue. You who are trying to be justified by the law, you see I highlighted that, have been alienated from Christ. You've fallen away from grace. So, is it possible that circumcision has more than one flavor? Kind of like Baskin Robbins, and that's not a South African reference. This is something to be explored at another date. Yes, indeed. Okay, let's continue. We're now at slide 36. Acts 16, 1 through 3. The question is, the Jews want him circumcised. Why? All right, let's examine what we got. If Timothy is Jewish, but he wasn't circumcised on the 8th day, but let's say he's Jewish, if he gets circumcised, then he's back in the covenant. According to Jews who do not believe that Yeshua is the Messiah, which is who Paul's appealing to here. He could do Jewish things, and that would be okay. But let's say that the understanding, if you had a Gentile father, let's say the understanding was that you're a Gentile. Okay, you ready for this? So he's a Gentile, and remember that this is for non-believing Jews. So if a Gentile does not go through with the proselyte ceremony, but gets circumcised, that's probably an abomination. Because if you try to bring him into the temple, you know that's going to profane the whole thing, and they're going to be all over this guy. So I'm going to say that probably unlikely that he was a Gentile. And Acts 21:28, you need to take a look at that just to update. I'm going to cover a little bit of that right here. If he was a Gentile, this presents a whole new problem. Look at this in Acts 21:21. James says to Paul, "They have been informed that you teach all the Jews who live among the Gentiles to turn away from Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children." Really? Paul is teaching this? But what is he doing? He is circumcising a Jew. Circumcising a Jew. And yet, the what would you call it? Rumor? The false rumor that's being circulated is that Paul's teaching don't do this, and yet Paul's doing it himself. Are you confused? I'm already confused. So this relationship here between Acts 16, 1 through 3 in the text, and then looking forward into Acts 21, which is where things really go sideways. And this is what they're saying. They're saying that Paul is teaching not to do this, and yet he's doing it. It's got to be false. I mean, really? Really? So one of the takeaways that I saw from one of the Protestant Christian commentaries that I examined, it said, it would appear that Paul sees circumcision as an acceptable practice when it's not to be justified before God, which is Galatians 5 and verse 4. So we're going to stop there. That is verse 3 of Acts 16. We're going to pick up at Acts 16, 4 through 12 when we take off on our next presentation. But this is just setting the table to get ready for the events that are coming. That is the end of this presentation, and now Rick will take questions. Thank you.